It is the Martha Zoller Show, and of course, yesterday was a really interesting day. Today is going to be a very interesting day. Niall Stanage is joining me right now from the Hill, and first, your thoughts, Niall, and welcome back to the program, is on that decision yesterday, because it kind of sent shockwaves. It didn't surprise me because I'm a constitutionalist, but 9-0 when you've got very conservative judges, very liberal judges, I think that's kind of a slam dunk, right?
Yes, I mean, anytime there's a unanimous verdict, I think it is a slam dunk, especially when, as we know, the court, like every other institution in American life, is itself more polarized, or has become more polarized in recent years. The other point I think that bears emphasizing, Martha, is that at oral arguments in this case in early February, it was notable that even some of the liberal justices, Justice Elena Kagan, for example, even Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson to some degree, did seem to express skepticism about Colorado's case. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean people were expecting a 9-0 verdict, but it was, I think, widely seen as an overreach by Colorado to do what it did.
So today, of course, is Super Tuesday. Polls are opened on the East Coast, Central, and they'll be all the way through today. This is kind of the last stand, I think, for Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley has gone back to South Carolina. She doesn't have any ads booked and no schedule for the rest of the week, unlike other primary nights where, you know, we knew she was going to Michigan after last Tuesday night. We knew where she was going after the South Carolina primary. So I think that, you know, reading the tea leaves, there could be some sort of an announcement tonight, because it does look like President Trump will win, and win handily, in all the states today.
Yes, absolutely. It looks like this could be very close to the end of the road for Nikki Haley, if not the actual end. You're quite right to note that during other contests, she had very clearly telegraphed that she was going on. She has conspicuously not said that, not given indications of that past Super Tuesday. And I honestly think Nikki Haley's chances of plausibly emerging as the victor in the Republican nomination process evaporated some time ago. But she has clearly decided to stay in to make the argument for a different kind of Republican Party, for a different kind of demeanor, at least, than the one that former President Trump presents. That has a certain amount of support, maybe 20-25% of support in the Republican Party, but, you know, clearly in a two-person race, 25% doesn't get you very far. And so I think it's around the point where she's going to be deciding to call it off.
Yeah, and to be fair, you know, I'm one of those women. I'm a suburban woman that not so much the president's demeanor, the former president's demeanor, turned me off, because I knew what I was getting into. My dad was a New Yorker. I voted for him twice, and I gave money to him in 2020. But after he meddled in our Georgia runoff in January 2021, where he told people, well, you can vote, but your vote might not count. And we had 430,000 Republicans not turn back out for the runoff. And I believe that's why we lost those 2 seats. And then his behavior on January 6th, I don't believe he incited the riot, but I do think that once the riot started, he waited way too long to say anything. And for me, that was unforgivable. So I have been supporting Nikki Haley throughout this process. And have already early voted in Georgia, and I don't mind saying I voted for her, even though she may not be in the race next week. But I've been thinking a lot about reunifying the party. How do they reunify the party? And I think a lot of that goes to President Trump's tone, and he seems to be at times trying to do that better tone. But I also thought a lot about that Supreme Court decision yesterday, and that probably the biggest legacy of the first Trump administration was the courts. All the confirmations he got on the federal level, as well as the Supreme Court justices, the 3 Supreme Court justices. And for me, one of the things I'm looking at is, who do I want to be replacing the next Supreme Court justice? And even though that's not a sexy topic, I don't know that many people decide that, but I think it's an important one to consider.
Sure. I mean, I think that lots of conservatives, and for that matter on the other side, lots of liberals, have become more attuned to the pivotal importance of presidential elections in terms of the judicial system generally, most prominently and importantly the Supreme Court, but also lower courts, which clearly have their own significant impacts. I don't have in front of me exactly how many judges in all were nominated by former President Trump, but it was certainly in the hundreds when you include the lower courts in that. That gives to any president a very lasting impact. If you think of the three Supreme Court justices who were nominated by then President Trump, those are people who can reasonably expect to serve on the Supreme Court for decades. And, you know, as we all know, the Supreme Court can determine some of the most divisive or important questions in American life. So any presidential election is enormously consequential when it comes to judicial nominations.
Well, and it's so funny because we look like we're going to have these two 80-year-olds, give or take a year or two, running against each other. I still don't know if Joe Biden will ultimately be the nominee, but that's an argument for another day. But it is interesting that on the courts, they're picking younger and younger people statistically. And that means in a lifetime appointment, you're going to spend a lot longer time on the bench. I think it's an interesting seesaw, isn't it? I mean, we got these two 80-year-olds running, but when they're making appointments to the courts, they are making appointments much younger than we are traditionally used to.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, for example, Justice Amy Coney Barrett, the third Trump nominee, she's 52 years old. Now, I mean, none of us ever knows what's around the corner, but it seems completely plausible that she could be on the court for 30 years.
Yes.
And, you know, she will have a significant impact through those decades and beyond them if she serves that length of time. So it is a way to really prolong to an enormous degree the influence that any president has. We've obviously already seen former President Trump influence in some of the decisions that have already been made, the Dobbs decision probably being the most obvious. And there will be other very vexing topics in American life that the court will ultimately determine. And those are things where the Trump influence or imprint will still be seen because of exactly the point that you raised.
So in Michigan, in the Democratic primary, there were roughly about 100,000 people that voted uncommitted. In Georgia, they are trying to do this movement where people go in, take a ballot, but don't vote for Joe Biden. They just leave it blank. Now, the problem in Georgia is that won't show up anywhere. In Michigan, that 100,000 uncommitted did show up as somehow like a write-in, okay? In Georgia, what it'll mean just if 100,000, it'll just be 100,000 less votes, and nobody will know that X number of people left it blank until, you know, a week or so later when they release that number. So it's not, I don't think it's going to create the same impact. But President Biden's got some issues related to his own party. We like to talk about reunifying the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party is as factioned as I've ever seen it, especially on issues like Israel and other things.
Yes, 100%. I think, in fact, that the president's policy on Israel and Gaza has really divided the Democratic Party and is likely to continue to do so. In fact, you could argue that those divides will deepen unless there's a ceasefire very soon, or even a longer-term resolution to that conflict. I think that the point that you raise about Michigan is an important one, because there was a data point to which people could direct attention and say, look, this shows the degree of Democratic dissatisfaction. From what you're telling me about Georgia, that will show up less clearly there. But these vote tallies or vote totals in Democratic primaries are only really a symptom of a bigger political problem for the president, which is that if you look at polling, and Democrats now overall in the broad conflict between Israel and the Palestinians, Democrats tend to have a plurality now favouring the Palestinians. That clearly was not the case a generation ago. It speaks to the degree to which younger voters on the left or left of centre, certainly they are very pronounced in their broad sympathy for the Palestinian cause. Now, that creates problems for President Biden, who is, much more of a stalwart supporter of Israel. That is a divisive position amid the bloodshed that we've seen in Gaza, the terrible humanitarian conditions there. It's a real political problem.
It's a political problem because most of the developed world has been giving money to Gaza in one way or another, whether it's through aid or whatever. And it appears to me, and I am very pro-Israel, so I want to be fair about that. But it appears to me that money has not been used for the Palestinian people over the years, not just since this conflict started, but for decades before that. And because Gaza could be Singapore, Niall. Gaza could be the most amazing place to visit. That, they used to call Lebanon the Paris of the Middle East. Gaza, had that money been actually spent to develop the people and the economic development, where would we be? But what I've seen, and I could be wrong, what I've seen is that even in this talk about this 6-week ceasefire, it seems to me it's a non-negotiable point for the Israelis that you got to release the hostages, or at the very least tell us who's still alive. And Hamas is not willing to do that. And if they're not willing to do that, then Israel's not going to stop.
Well, I think that the Israel-Palestinian issue is one that people have very different, not only different opinions on, but look at things through very different lenses on. There are 30,000 people approximately dead. There are 1.8 million approximately displaced. There are 500,000 approximately starving, according to the United Nations. So that's a fact. And that's why I think there's so much democratic discontent with President Biden's backing of the Israelis.
And I hear you on all of that. It's just, if you can tell numbers at that level, and I'm not talking about you, I'm talking about organizations, then I think it's only right that we can know how many hostages are still alive and where they are. Mm-hmm. That's a small number,
sure.
And I don't think it's an unreasonable request to know where because they're not combatants. These folks were not combatants. These people were people that were ripped out of their homes or out of a music festival or whatever. And we don't know ultimately what's happened to them. About half of them have been released, I think, roughly, that number is. But it's so frustrating to me because I know it seems simple to me, because it seems like on October 7th, this horrible thing happened. This worst day since the Holocaust happened, and that it could be very simple to end, if they release the hostages. Now, granted, I know it's not that simple. I'm not so naive, but it just seems to me a place to start is that to tell who the hostages are and how many are still alive.
Yeah, I'm certainly not. I don't want to get into
no. I understand. And look, I'm not saying. I'm just saying from a humanitarian standpoint, that's not an unreasonable request. That's all I'm saying.
No, but it's also. But don't you think it's also something that underlines how President Biden has taken the view that the best way to approach this is to be supportive of Israel, which has led him to be supportive of Netanyahu. And Biden's argument is that has preserved American influence. Now, what we see just over the past week is American influence is actually so paltry in this situation that the United States itself has to risk its logistics and its personnel to drop food to people who would otherwise starve. Do you not think that raises questions about Biden's strategy and his?
Oh, it does. I think it all goes back to a real lack of leadership and strength that President Biden has had in a number of issues, And it's one of the issues that I think are most important in choosing a president is how they're going to handle national security. But Niall Stanage, you can go to the Hill and you can see his comments on things on a regular basis. He's also on News Nation, and we appreciate you being with us today. Thank you.